Hey guys, welcome back. So now with our first talk with getting into Infinite Frontier, I think it would make sense for us that we start off with the Joker. Because prior to this point, we've talked a lot about Future State, which once again is like your timeline placeholder for your future, the DCU, moving forward after Death Metal. But by no means are we done talking Future State, but in the process I do want to talk about Infinite Frontier because Future State by design has a lot of cliffhangers, to where on the other hand, Infinite Frontier with the Joker, it connects a lot of what we talked about with Nightwing, Red Hood, and also a little bit of what we mentioned with Dark Detective. And for that reason, I want to get into Infinite Frontier Joker for the sake of cohesiveness, if nothing else. So let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch your spills every week. And don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so jumping in, we start off with a prologue that begins with your younger Jim Gordon, who in his earlier years he started in Gotham, but then he was transferred to Chicago by Captain Gillian Loeb, who at the time was a crooked captain who wanted to get this new kid who was a good cop and who was honest and straightforward out of his way, which is why Jim Gordon got transferred to Chicago. And in this prologue, we get Jim Gordon thinking back to his last night in Chicago just before he had came back to Gotham, which he would describe as like a promotion and transfer to hell. But with Jim thinking back to his last night in Chicago, he remembers a conversation that he had with a guy by the name of Danny Ryan, who's an older gentleman to whom his father was more or less one of the legends of the Chicago PD around the time of your Al Capone era. But with Jim thinking back on this night and this conversation, he remembers Danny asking him if he was old enough to have gotten his boogeyman. And at first, Jim doesn't fully understand like what Danny means, but then Danny tells him that he's referring to that perp that you see when you close your eyes every night. That was that one perp who was just always worse than all the others. And at this time in Jim's life, he's seen some things, like he's been to war and he's seen active criminals in the streets, but Danny cuts him off and he tells Jim like, nah, you're too young. Because Danny tells him like when he refers to boogeyman, he's not talking about either your common criminal or even your soldier who's doing what they believe they need to do for their country, but instead someone who does the unthinkable, but like for no reason at all. And initially Jim is like, okay, let me pick up your tab, you had a few too many, which Danny probably has, but then Danny tells Jim like, no, stop and listen, because Jim might learn something from this old man. And it's here where Danny asks Jim the question, does he believe in evil? And at the time, Jim responds like, yeah, sure. And like when Danny hears this, like the way that Jim responds, he immediately knows that Jim just hasn't seen it all yet. Because immediately after, Danny then goes on to tell Jim that when he was younger, around the age of Jim at this time, he had seen the devil himself. And he goes on to tell Jim the story of the time where he answered to a response, only to arrive at the scene to see this guy eating the face off of a 17-year-old girl. And when Danny arrived, the dude was laughing hysterically, he tossed a piece to Danny, and after that, the guy got away out the fire escape. And initially, the story kind of catches Jim like, dude, why are you telling me this? But then it's here where Danny makes the point to Jim that he's telling him this because at the time, Danny says that he was much like Jim. He played things by the book, and he tried to handle every situation according to the law, but it was that night for Danny that changed his mind. And because of that, Danny tells Jim that when it comes to the law, that there are some criminals you handle by the books, but when it comes to evil, you aim for the head. But with hearing this, like at the time for Jim, he kind of dismissed it because he believed more often than not he would hear similar tellings from either crooked cops who would try to justify their actions. But for Jim, over time, looking back at this conversation, he realizes that Danny wasn't trying to give him an explanation or justify any actions, but instead Danny was giving Jim a warning of a boogeyman that he would eventually come around and face if he would just keep on living. Which in the case of Jim Gordon, over the course of time, he found his boogeyman, which is the same face that keeps him up at night, who in his case is a Joker, which then brings us to present day where Jim Gordon still has this issue. And even with saying that, like I could imagine, like if there was any defining moment when the Joker had became Jim Gordon's boogeyman, that it had to be the Killing Joke. And not only because of the Joker shooting his daughter, but also with the psychological torture that Jim had been put through at the time. So in my opinion, if we had to pinpoint a date on it, or at least narrow it down to a time frame to where Jim had found his boogeyman, my vote is on the Killing Joke. But then after this, we jump forward into present day of the story, which takes us to Arkham Asylum right after A-Day. And so now, like prior to this point, we've talked about the repercussions of A-Day, with much of our talks within Future State, with Nightwing, with Red Hood, and Dark Detective, but it really isn't until a few different issues within Infinite Frontier to where we get a closer look of what actually happened. And like it's here where Jim Gordon gives the recap of what had taken place. We find out that it was a deadly gas attack that killed nearly 500, counting patients, staff, and security. but also because of the scale of this event and it making United States history as the biggest, deadliest gas attack, it had soon been known nationwide as A-Day. But also with getting into a few more of the details, we find out that the gas bombs, they had went off at midnight, and that this deadly toxin was a modified version of the original Joker toxin. But in this case, it was set with the intention to kill, and as a result, there wasn't much of any laughing, so people were just Jokerized and dead. But amongst the few survivors, like one name stood out to Gordon, and it was the name of a security officer by the name of Sean Mahoney, who was able to save a few of the staff members by catching the release of the toxin early, and he was successful by burning some of it out of the air for those who were nearby him. But with doing so, he was injured severely. But when Jim finds this out, he also remembers that he denied Mahoney a spot on the police force 6 times during the time that Jim was commissioner, and now after hearing what Mahoney had did during A-Day, it really makes Jim question like his judgment of character. But aside from this, Jim also mentions that Batman, he had arrived at the scene before the police, and he was able to disperse the toxin from the air before they arrived. But even with that being the case, Mayor Nakano still directed his men to arrest Batman due to the supposed lack of footage or evidence pointing elsewhere. And this leaned more so into the reports that were saying that because of what Mahoney did with burning the toxin out of the air to try to save the staff and others, that this had also burned and destroyed a lot of evidence. And really all the police have at this time is like their listing of those presumed dead and some confirmed dead, to where in this case, Scarecrow and Jeremiah Arkham, they're presumed dead, but others like Bane have been confirmed. But also like in the case of Bane, like with confirmation of his death, like he got a lot of love in the streets because he had a mural made for him in Little Santa Prisca, and after his passing, like in spite of what he's done, a lot of people still looked at him as like a symbol of strength. And most of this really just came from like your Latin American community who connected with Bane, with many of them being from Santa Prisca, and with Bane's passing, you have your group of people who decided to make him a symbol. But also like with this happening and Bane being one of the bodies who was confirmed, like this was one of the few deaths that Gordon actually believed, and because of that he also wanted the opportunity to examine Bane's body, but even with doing so, Gordon was denied access. But then also on top of this, Gordon mentions that Mayor Nakano, he's been doing some shifting around with the GCPD, which had mainly started after Joker War, after Harvey Bullock had stepped down as commissioner. And since that time, Mayor Nakano, he's been stepping in and out of the commissioner role, but it was 3 days after A-Day to where Nakano had reached out to Gordon, and with doing so, showing Gordon that there's footage of the Joker leaving the asylum months prior, to where they believe that the Joker had planted these gas bombs with the intention of setting them off at a later date. But when Mayor Nakano showed these to Gordon, he just kind of nodded like he hadn't seen them before, because with the mayor showing Gordon these pictures 3 days after, Gordon had already been looking over a lot of these images with Batman 2 days ago. But with Gordon not wanting to be involved with Nakano, he then asked the mayor to reconsider his stance on Batman, and with doing so, knowing that the mayor's not gonna budge, and more so using that questioning to kind of shut him up and tell him no at the same time. But Gordon turns it down rather than working on it and having his hands tied. But also, even aside from that, Gordon is just at the point in his life where he's ready to move forward. But even aside from Gordon meeting with the mayor, he had also got a message from Harvey Bullock, to where Harvey had pitched the idea of both of them going into private investigation together, but Gordon didn't want to take that route either. Because for Gordon, he remembers cheating on his first wife with Sarah Scene, and because of that, he knows that good people can make mistakes, and because of that, he doesn't want to be a private investigator, to where he makes a living off of catching good people when they're down. But on top of this, like for Gordon, in conversations with his daughter Barbara, she often tells him that he just needs to close his eyes and just picture the future that he wants for himself, whether it's what he wants to do next or how he sees himself retiring. But for Gordon, when he closes his eyes, like the only thing he hears is laughter. And when he opens his eyes, it's not too much different because of the whole situation with Punchline, with her being arrested after Joker War, and a lot of the kids in the streets being inspired by Punchline and wearing her name on their t-shirts, and in some cases even dressing up like the Joker or Punchline in order to intimidate others while committing crimes. But like also with this being the case, it makes me think like, you know, not long ago I had Punchline and Joker as like wallpapers on my desktop. And I just want to say my bad, Gordon. Sorry, not sorry. But then also from here, we jump over to one of those frequent conversations which Gordon has with his daughter Barbara. But between the two of them, most of the conversation is like Barbara trying to help her father and get him towards the idea of retirement. But for Gordon, he has a tough time even having these conversations, because for Gordon, he likes the idea and he would like to retire and just leave and move to somewhere warm. But financially, Gordon barely has enough money to retire in his own apartment for another year or two. And on top of that, like when Gordon even thinks about it, it's almost like he can hear the Joker leaning looking over and laughing at his situation. But then also, like, just to give a bit more context to this, because with Barbara trying to help her father figure these things out, like for her, this may also be coming from a place of guilt. And I say this because closer to around the time of the Joker War, or more so leaning up to the Joker War, back when we talked about the Joker paying Barbara another visit, like not long after that had taken place, you had also had this instance to where someone was seducing women who had looked like Batgirl, and with doing so matching her height, matching her weight, and were close enough to her age, but more or less they would pass for Batgirl once in the costume. Well, with Barbara going through with this investigation, she had found out that this was being done by her brother, James Gordon Jr. And it was pretty sad how it played out, because on one hand, James Gordon was actually trying to do better. And even at one point on his own, he was trying to help Barbara so that she wouldn't become the next victim of this person who's killing redheads. But because of James's condition, he had then developed dual personalities to where on one side it had very much went back to the serial killer, and the other was more of your recent James Gordon Jr., who we had seen more recently, who had sincerely wanted to do better. And with this better side being jealous of his sister and the attention that she got from their father, which the better James figured that's something he'll deal with and move forward. But his darker half, like the other side of his duality, he had started creating and killing Batgirls in order to make the good side of James feel better. And it was a crazy reveal because when Barbara found this out, both Jameses started talking to each other and they figured out that Barbara was Batgirl, and with Barbara trying to help him out, and mind you, like at this point Barbara didn't care that he figured it out, and in James's effort to protect Barbara and their family, he told her that stopping this evil himself was the only way, which was like a real tragic ending for the character of James Gordon Jr. Because you guys know, like you guys that have been rocking with me for a while, you already know, like I wanted James Gordon Jr., like his narrative to kind of lean into like the dark hero, which is where it felt like it was going for a while, but unfortunately at the time it just led to a tragic ending. But also when this happened, Gordon, he had blamed Batgirl, with her being there at the time, and also in a sense Barbara had blamed herself, but really all in all it was just a tragic situation that still has its lingering effects on the both of them to this day. And it's why I say I believe that Barbara, she's helping her father not just because it's her father and she wants the best for him, which I believe she does, but I also believe there's an underlying amount of guilt there as well, with Barbara feeling guilty for having gone through certain things, whether they were the prior attacks of the Joker and these challenges made her stronger, versus the things that James dealt with from his childhood, which he had to deal with his entire life. But for Jim, like when he later visits his son's grave and he thinks of these comparisons which James had made between himself and his sister, and it causes him not only to think back on how the Joker pushed things over the edge, with the ways that the Joker has affected this family's life from different angles, but for Jim, he also sees this as a Joker lapping over the grave of James as well. But in addition to this, for Jim, like leaving his son's gravesite, he's then confronted by this wealthy woman and her muscle who looks like he's straight out of the Resident Evil franchise, but with confronting Jim, she tells him to get in the car so they can discuss business concerning the Joker. And Jim, he doesn't really argue, he just gets in the car and more or less he's kind of like, hey, my life, it figures. But with talking to this mysterious lady, she then takes Jim to a mansion which he believes is hers, but she tells him like, nope, it's not mine and I'm not telling you whose it is, because pertaining to the business that they're here to speak of, she wants to keep most of it as confidential as possible. And when Jim asks like, at least like, what do I address you by, she then tells him that he can just call her Cressida. But when Jim points to the muscle and he's like, well, what about him? Cressida's then like, well, you don't call him anything. And I tell you right now, Jim's better than me because I would have just called him Nemesis and left it at that. And dude would have chased me out of the mansion and that would have been the end of it right there. But from here where Cressida opens the conversation, she gives Jim a few pictures of the Joker that were taken in Belize a few weeks ago. And this plane had originally been chartered from this private airfield outside of Gotham, which also belongs to the friends of her family, to whom the identity of Cressida does not want to disclose. Because even prior to this happening, these private jets weren't to be known of by the government, which is why she's approaching Jim with this proposition anyway. But with Jim hearing this and seeing these pictures, for him this is all new information. The mayor doesn't have this update, which immediately lets him know she hasn't gone to the police, but then on top of that, Jim also knows that Batman isn't aware of this as well. But he doesn't bring up the Batman part. But with showing Jim this information, Cressida lets him know that the people that she works for, that they want the Joker taken out for good, and for that reason they called her to reach out to Jim Gordon because he has more experience than anyone in hunting the Joker, and on top of that the motivation to see this job through as well, with the Joker nearly killing Barbara and instigating the death of his son James. But even with this, like Jim admits that he is capable of tracking down the Joker, but he lets her know he's not just gonna drop everything and fly to Belize. But then it's here where Cressida really hits him, because she tells Jim that she knows that Jim's not in the best situation financially, and that for him a retirement plan is pretty much non-existent. And it's here where she tells him that upon his trip he'll be given a car with unlimited funds, and as far as the job, upon completion $25 million will be deposited within his bank account. And when Jim hears this, it gets his attention, so he's like, okay, just to be clear, you want me to capture the Joker and bring him back to Gotham for $25 million. But then Cressida's like, oh no, like if we just wanted a bounty and somebody to grab him and bring him back to the States, we would have just called the police. And it's here where she makes it clear as day to Jim that they want him to kill the Joker. And it's crazy because like initially when Jim hears this, he expresses like what a lot of us are probably thinking, like with the fact that he's a former police commissioner, but then on top of that, like the fact that he's not a hitman. But Cressida then goes further to tell him like these are some of the reasons why he's perfect for the job. And on top of that, with his unique history with the Joker, she also believes that he's more qualified than a hitman to actually get this done. And after saying this, like when Jim asks her, like, why do you believe I would say yes to this? She then asks Jim, does he believe in evil? And this time, without hesitation, he says, yes, I do. Which shows us like right off the bat, like Jim, the older Jim, he sees the world much differently than the younger Jim Gordon leaving Chicago. But then it's here where Cressida tells him that he doesn't have to decide right away. But in the event that Jim decides to take this job, then he could prevent the Joker from coming back and continuing the cycle of chaos, which he's done over the years time and time again. And in the case of Jim, instead of just leaving behind the position of commissioner, just knowing that Gotham's gonna fall into this same cycle again, he now has the choice to agree to her terms and do something that'll change Gotham forever, and on top of that, get the retirement that she says he deserves. But then on top of this, we then jump over to Belize, and not so much as a sign that Jim took the job, like the screen flips and you see Jim just dancing out in Belize, but instead in this case, we're kind of shown what's going on over there in the meantime. But heading over there, we do get a bit more narration from Jim, and he talks about how, like in the case of Danny Ryan, who had asked Jim the question years ago if he believed in evil, and Jim thinks back on how the story of Danny Ryan ended, which had pretty much concluded with Danny Ryan taking his own life after years of obsessing of trying to catch the killer he had seen that night, which had only led to a number of dead ends, and it eventually drove Danny insane. And at this point, Jim Gordon's thinking over these things, likely to the notion of deciding whether or not he's going to take this job, because deep down inside he also knows like where this manhunt could lead. Like if he were to take this job, never find the Joker, and eventually lose his mind and end up like Danny Ryan. And while Gordon is thinking this over, we then find that this whole setting in Belize is in fact where the Joker is, to where at this point he's murdered more people, taken their home, and he's just reading the Gotham Gazette, catching up with all the details post A-Day. And so now real quick, I want to give a special shout out to all the patrons. Thank you guys for all your support. And for anyone who's new here who wants more information on how to support the channel, I got a link below so you can go to patreon.com/Dopespill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Whew. Man, James Tynion. Man, if you don't direct or write the next Joker movie, like I don't know what's happening. Because honestly, I can't remember the last time that I read something like this that made me feel this invested in a long time. But let me know your thoughts down in the comments below or over on Discord, and we'll do it again on the next one. Alright, later.